Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Penwell Corporation, the parent company of fire engineering, we welcome you to the 89th FDIC International. And now, please welcome the Education Director for FDIC and the Editor-in-Chief of Fire Engineering, Chief Bobby Halton.
Welcome. This 89th FDIC is officially devoted to the memory of all of those we lost this year to cancer, including our dear friend John Hanson, Bobby Reno, and thousands of others, and to those that are struggling with cancer. This 89th FDIC is formally and officially dedicated with great humility to the men and women serving currently in harm's way aboard the USS Boxer LDH-4. On behalf of all of us in the American Fire Service, our gratitude and thanks to all of our veterans and to especially the men and women currently serving on USS Boxer LDH-4. Thomas Hobbes, a philosopher from the 1600s, wrote the following: "Hereby it is manifest that during which the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war. And such a war is of every man against every man." In contrast, the old hippie writer, Kurt Vonnegut, once said, "I can think of no more stirring symbol of man's humanity to man than the firefighter, than the fire truck." I apologize. Because I can think that as beautiful and eloquent as Mr. Vonnegut's comment is, I think it misses the mark. I think a more correct statement would be, I can think of no more stirring symbol of man's humanity to man than the firefighter, as I stated earlier. As beautiful and iconic as the fire truck is, it's but a symbol, but a machine, an artifact, a continually evolving reflection of technology and science. But the firefighter, that charismatic, quintessential, heroic image of all that is good and honest and noble, is a far better symbol. And it's far more fitting when we think of man's humanity to man that we think of the firefighter. This realization imposes tremendous demands on firefighters, on you. Tremendous moral and ethical demands. If, as the great Thomas Hobbes said, that life is but a war of every man against every man, then it's even more important that we firefighters and those who care and support firefighters participate in proving that a meaningful life is really about mitigating that war in individual ways, in small ways that make life more secure, safer, and satisfying. You see, firefighters are men and women who exemplify many virtues and can be the difference, perhaps the exception. By being that symbol of humanity, maybe we can soften or hopefully end that war that Hobbes so eloquently depicted. Today, the fire service finds itself in an interesting time, a time of great discovery and great debate, a time of tremendous advances and equally troubling criticisms. They say that every generation has an opportunity to define itself. They say that every generation has a season. But beyond that, great professions have more than seasons, they have more than generations. Great callings like the military, law enforcement, the clergy, medicine, and especially the fire service have a character for which they are known and for which they will always be known. And that character has virtues and traits that define it. It has principles and morals that constrain its participants and simultaneously liberate us in our endeavors to accomplish our sacred mission. It becomes self-evident that how one conducts oneself in manners of honor, courage, and civility is dictated by one's background and education as a gentleman or a gentlewoman. Much of that education and training we receive from our parents. George Washington is noted for saying, "All that I am, I owe to my mother. I attribute all my success in life to the moral, intellectual, and physical education that I received from her." Now, there's a school of thought that believes we're born with a certain set of character traits, if you will, a certain set of inclinations and predispositions, and that may well be the case. But I think those predispositions speak more to one's personality than to one's character. Most agree that with training, with example, with exposure, and with habit, one can create, if you will, a character. For firefighters, this character should involve certain basic principles, such as devotion to the mission, loyalty to our fellow firefighters, respect for authority, and a desire to reflect the highest moral ideal. For us firefighters, that one ideal which rises above all the others is, simply put, honor before all. Honor ante omnia. We will never, under any circumstances, leave anyone behind, whether they be rich or poor, like us or different from us, mentally healthy or mentally ill, contributing to society or living off the generosity of society. We leave no one behind. We must believe in higher principles, greater ideals, and lofty considerations. We can imbue firefighters with heroic dreams. Benjamin Disraeli said, "Nurture your minds with great thoughts. To believe in the heroic makes heroes." It is clear that with the right mentoring, examples, diligence, we can help good men and women become great firefighters. Our industry has a history of tradition and heroism. It's often been remarked that the highest praise a firefighter could receive at their death or retirement is that they lived and worked according to the best traditions of our service. Ours is a high standard, yet not an unreasonable standard, yet a standard which is continuously threatened. Almost 20 years ago, on this very stage, the American Fire Service sage Tom Brennan issued a dire warning. He said, "We are losing our fire service. It is time to take her back." In response to Tom's prediction, little has been done, but it is not too late to repair. For fortunately, the bedrock principle of our beloved industry has not changed. It's still held dearly by all true firefighters who so justly value their own true dignity of character and who place so high a value on their virtue that all other inferior considerations pale upon reflection and refuse to be changed or influenced by popular culture or faddish trends. This principle, honor ante omnia, that we leave no one behind, its simplicity disguises its strength, its unquestionable goodness defies blemish, and its fundamental integrity subdues assault. Honor ante omnia. We leave no one behind, not by intention or omission, not for self-preservation or self-interest, not physically, not emotionally, not spiritually. We leave no one behind. We ordinary firefighters understand this well. And we insist that the mission we have pledged our sacred honor to is not a suicidal one or a fatalistic one, and that we never intend to place ourselves nor anyone else in harm's way haphazardly or casually, but rather we profess that our mission is to care for, protect, and defend our fellow citizens' property, material well-being, and lives in ways that have been carefully vetted, thoroughly examined, and diligently rehearsed in a wide variety of styles and situations, that the manner and the seriousness by which we intend to promote the defense of our communities, property, people, and purpose is reflected in our behavior, is noticed in our conduct, and exemplified in our character. The answer to Tom's clarion call has been with us since our inception. It requires we do as George Washington directed us to do when he said, "Let us raise a standard to which the wise and the honest can repair. The rest is in the hands of God." To raise that standard requires that we embody fairness, requires that we exemplify self-control, requires that we exhibit sympathy, requires that we embrace duty. For firefighting, at its most basic level, is a moral philosophy, a code that defies what's considered normal behavior today. For firefighting reverts back to a simpler time, perhaps a more natural time. And although we may disagree about what is natural, we can never escape the fact that all persons have a nature, a set of traits and predispositions that defines what they are willing to do. And for firefighters, it absolutely suggests what it is we must do. So let's begin by talking about our fundamental virtues, beginning with the virtue of fairness. Such a display of fairness and character was on display on December 20th, 1943. During what could have been called a war of every man against every man in the skies above occupied France, involving a German ace and the crew of a B-17. German fighter pilot Franz Stigler had just landed his brand new Messerschmitt 109 to rearm and refuel. Franz was no ordinary pilot. He was an ace many times over, and he was just one bomber kill away from Germany's highest award, the Knight's Cross. Franz had been an airline pilot before the war, and he was drafted into the military. Franz was an ordinary German soldier. He was not a Nazi. Franz was one of those ordinary Germans who was drawn into the conflict against his will and flying to defend his country as soldiers have for generations. His first assignment, after being drafted, had been to Africa, to the Europe Nights, where he learned the aviator's code. When he first arrived, his officer, Captain Riddell, took him aside and he said, "Here we live by a code. Every time you go up, you will be outnumbered. Those odds may make a man want to fight dirty to survive, but let what I'm about to say to you act as a warning. Honor is everything here. If I ever hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you down myself. You follow the rules of war for you, not for your enemy. You fight by the rules to keep your humanity." Franz had lived by those rules throughout the war. So as he smoked his cigarette, he heard the weak engines of a B-17 in the skies behind him. He flicked away his smoke, climbed into his plane. 10 miles ahead of him, barely in the skies, flew a B-17 they called, for firefighters appropriately, the Pub. For its crew, it was their first flight. On this morning, because they were the rookie crew, the new guys, they were assigned to Purple Heart Corner, outside edge of the formation, an easy target. The captain's name was Charlie Brown. Charlie's crew was an incredible group of men, all young, all volunteers, all eager to prove their worth and do their duty, not unlike today's young firefighters. Now, during the bombing run, the Pub's plexiglass nose had been blown off by flak, allowing a sub-zero wind to rush into the plane, freezing everything in its path, including their guns. Shrapnel had ripped through the aircraft. After dropping their bombs on target, the 109 was heavily damaged. The 109s were swarming this heavily damaged B-17. Enemy bullets and cannon shells ripped it apart. In a final act of desperation, Charlie tries a desperate dive and flips the plane upside down, trying to throw off the fighters. Not recommended in the training manual. At the very last second, Charlie was able to pull it out and fly a few hundred feet above the ground and started slowly limping towards the English coast, the French coast, and the English Channel. They were coming up on the French coast. The Germans had given a name to that fortified coastline. They called it the Atlantic Wall. With 2 dead and 1 severely wounded, the crew of the pub could never imagine that their worst danger on the ground below them was Franz Stigler and not the Atlantic Wall. Charlie told his co-pilot, nicknamed Pinky, to tell the crew that he was going to fly the wounded back to England, but that anyone who wanted to bail out and save themselves had his permission. No one took him up on his offer. Behind the pub, Franz had begun his attack run. He aimed through his gun sight. He looked at the tail position closely, waiting for the tail gunner to return fire, but nothing happened. Something's wrong, he thought. He looked at the missing stabilizer that had been blown away, and he muttered to himself, "My God, how are you still flying?" From 100 yards away, he could see fist-sized holes that had been punched in the tail gunner position, and he could see the tail gunner slumped over his guns with icicles of blood coming from his collar. Now, Franz had seen planes shot to pieces before, but he had never seen anything like this. Every foot of this bomber had holes where the bullets had entered and flaked away the body of that B-17. He could see that the shells had ripped away the skin to the frame, and he could see the crew, defenseless, huddled over one another, caring for their wounded. Now, ace Franz Stigler could easily have another kill, could easily destroy this enemy bomber, and win the Knight's Cross. But there, in the skies over France, came back the code. Franz knew that the French coast and its guns were just a few miles ahead. He knew he could save these warriors from his guns, but not from the guns below. Franz drew his 109 alongside the cockpit of the wounded B-17. His eyes met Charlie's. Charlie couldn't believe what he's seeing. He turns to Pinky and he says, "He's going to destroy us." Franz mouthed the word Sweden, Sweden, over and over again and kept pointing to the east. Franz knew they could land there. Sweden was neutral, and it was much closer and safer than trying to fly over the approaching guns and the English Channel. But Pinky and Charlie thought he was trying to get them to surrender. After many attempts, Franz realized this B-17 intended to fly over the guns and attempt to make it back to England. Right then and there, Franz decided to stay on their wing, hoping to protect these fellow warriors from the guns below. On the ground, the confused gunners look up. Seeing a 17 and a 109 flying wingtip to wingtip, they assume the 17 must have been captured and was being used as a decoy, so they never fired. 10 miles out, over the English Channel, Franz knew there was nothing more he could do for his brave enemies. He said a silent prayer, saluted his fellow pilots, and he turned his 109 back towards France, where he knew he awaited court-martial and execution for this high act of treason. Fairness. Codes. 2 words that saved the lives of 7 airmen that day, men who would go on to have dozens of children and grandchildren. The Gestapo never came for Franz Stigler. For some reason, his act of treason was never reported to the Nazis. He survived the war, as did Charlie Brown. They were reunited many years later, and they became the best of friends. Franz Stigler died in March of 2008. Charlie Brown died in November of 2008. When their story was told, Many thought it was unbelievable. But for those of us who have served and those of us who have risked their lives for others, that story rang true of many other stories. Stories of men and women who lived by a code and who broke the rules so that others might live, who stood as symbols of humanity, who stood as symbols of fairness. Honor ante omnia. Honor before all. Now, firefighters have a chance to practice fairness every day. We respond to every call, regardless of what neighborhood they came from, regardless of who made the call. We respond to every call, and we treat everyone there with the same dignity and respect, whether they be criminal or victim, whether they be abusive or grateful, whether they be threatening or compliant. We treat everyone fairly, and no one gets left behind based on any standard, any ideology, despite the risks, the rules, or the regulations. But the question becomes, how do we teach fairness in a world where the very word fairness has been corrupted and confused by ideologies and warped political theory? In a world that takes the very word fairness and turns it into the opposite of what it truly represents? It's questionable how much virtue you can teach in a classroom. It's not something you'll get in a lecture or you can read in a book. We learn virtue from our parents, our role models. It is learned through repetition. We are rewarded from an early age for doing the right thing with regard to small issues, and so we repeat that behavior by beginning small, and we create a pattern of good manners, restraint, moderation, and resilience. Perhaps Aristotle said it best: we become just by the practice of just actions, self-controlled by exercising self-control, which brings us to the virtue of sympathy. Probably the most difficult to define, but the most brilliant when it is seen. We are taught from an early age to praise only those motives that have defeated self-interest. And so we reserve our greatest praise for those motives that have the greatest difficulty in overcoming self-interest. Sympathy, simply put, is the ability to be affected by the feelings and experiences of others. It was late January, 1985. Weather was well below freezing. Call came in at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was a familiar call to a familiar location and more than likely a familiar customer. Engine 15, Rescue 3 were toned out to back up an ambulance. Our captain, Herman Sanchez, and the crew headed dutifully to the rig. The rescue driver, Umar de Jojo de Ningrat, lit up the rescue and drove her skillfully behind the engine. Everyone was tired. Everyone was cold from a fire earlier in the evening, and we were eager to find out what had pulled us from our bunks and out into the cold, bitter night once again. A small group of cops stood there doing the cop thing with their flashlights, pointing at a 30-ish or so homeless man who was extremely inebriated and feeling ill. Some of us headed back to get the gurney while the medics worked to get information from the homeless customer. Vital signs were taken, information was gathered, and the caller was taken away by the ambulance to a hospital. Crews were quiet in the rigs as we headed back to the station. Once back at the house, everyone's getting down from the rigs, and we're heading back to the bunk room when Lieutenant Mora stops Omar and says, "Omar, where are your shoes and socks?" Omar said, "I gave them to him." Lieutenant Mora said, "You gave them to who?" Omar said, "To the homeless guy. He didn't have any socks and shoes." Omar didn't say anything else. He turned around and walked back to the bunk room. Omar was not a rich man. He was a Vietnam vet and a good engineer, but he had issues, just like we all do. He had debts and he had personal concerns, but he had an incredible sense of sympathy. He taught us all that night that our own personal comfort is not what this job is about. He taught us all that night that it's not the big things that you do, it's the small. He taught us all that night that kindness isn't something you do once in a while, it's something you do all the time. He taught us all that night a lesson of what it truly means to be a firefighter. He taught us all that night what it really means to leave no one behind, even if it means you continue your shift without your socks and shoes. Which leaves us with duty and self-control. The life of a firefighter is a contradiction. While like all people, we fear a violent death, yet at the same time, we're willing to risk it to save others. Like all people, we want to be happy and spend time with our families, yet we're willing to risk it to serve strangers. Jay Jonas, who's currently a battalion chief with the FDNY, was a captain on 9/11. Jay vividly recalls that day. He remembers standing in the lobby of the North Tower. That's the first tower that got hit when the second tower got hit by a plane. He remembers there were groups of firefighters standing about who said to one another, "This could be our last day here, fellas. It's been good working with you." They stood around, shook one another's hands for a few moments, telling each other how good it's been to work with each other and how much they've enjoyed one another and wishing one another good luck. Jay understood, and he said it very well. He said, "We knew we were in mortal danger, but we disregarded it. They disregarded it because there were still people trapped in that building, and they had no intention of leaving anyone behind." Jay and his crew recalls that they ran into Captain Patty Brown in that lobby. Patty said to Jay, "They're just going to send you up, so there's no point in checking in at the command post." But Jay felt compelled to go check in anyway. At the command post, Jay was told to take his crew up to the target floor. That's where the plane impacted the building. Jay and his crew began ascending the building, stopping every 10 floors to catch their breath and rearrange their gear. They made it to the 27th floor when they felt the collapse of the South Tower. Jay sent another captain to look out the windows on the south side of the building, and he went and looked out on the north. Jay recalls seeing nothing except thick white dust up against the window. The other captain came back and told Jay the South Tower was gone. All of them then just realized that thousands had lost their lives, and among those thousands were hundreds of their friends. Jay and the crew heard the order to descend, and so they began their descent of the North Tower. On the 23rd floor, the crew ran into a woman named Josephine. She was in great distress, crying and complaining because of her health that she could not descend the stairs and that the pain she was experiencing made it increasingly painful to try to navigate the stairs. One of Captain Jonas's crew, Tommy Falco, said, "Cap, what are we going to do?" Jay said, "We can't leave her behind." So the firefighters propped Josephine up between them and began their descent down the stairs. Everyone on that crew knew that carrying Josephine down would greatly slow their descent, putting them at tremendous risk. But they had no intention of leaving anyone behind. When they reached the 4th floor, they decided to try to find a chair in which to carry Josephine. Finding none, they returned to the stairwell when suddenly they felt the entire building collapsing around them. Surviving the collapse, Jay got on the radio and called out a mayday. Firefighters outside answered the call and told Jay, "We're coming for you." Jay and his crew thought, "Others must certainly be hurt worse than us. So why is all this attention being focused on us?" It was at that point they were told that they were the only ones the rescuers were talking to. It was at that point that Jay recalls hearing another radio transmission. He recalls hearing Chief Hayden order everyone to evacuate the building, and he remembers hearing Captain Patty Brown respond. Patty Brown, a decorated FDNY firefighter, 2-tour Vietnam vet, a boxer, a yoga instructor, an all-around Renaissance man, was the captain on Ladder 3 that day. Jay vividly recalls hearing Chief Hayden call out from the command post, "Command post to Ladder 3! Command post to Ladder 3! Evacuate the building! Evacuate the building!" Jay also recalls hearing these words, "It was Captain Patty Brown. This is the officer of Ladder Company 3. I refuse the order. I have too many burned people here with me, and I'm not leaving them." Patty Brown had with him that day his working platoon and the off-duty platoon on that 34th Sky Lobby. Brave and heroic men who would leave no one behind and who we will not leave behind. Not in our memories, not in our hearts, not in our minds, and not in our character. Thomas Hobbes might have been brilliant, and Thomas Hobbes might have been one of the world's greatest philosophers. And for some, maybe life is a war of all against all, but not for us, not for firefighters. For firefighters, it's about saving all. For firefighters, it's about basic virtues, basic principles, honor, and a code. For at the very root of the firefighter, we find persons who desire to act virtuously. Not only do we firefighters find it to be worthy in its own merit, we find being virtuous to be necessary. We find being virtuous to be right. The most powerful disposition is for self-preservation. And so our most heartfelt and elaborate tributes go out to those who have sacrificed their lives so that others might live. These tributes are rare because such heroism is rare. But what is not rare in the fire service is virtue. Honor above all. To some, simply words. To us, a code. It is this code that makes us the symbol of man's humanity to man. It is this code that binds us as a fraternity of the world's bravest men and women. It is with this simple code, honor before all, that we take back our fire service and that we raise that standard to which the wise and the honest can repair. It is with this simple code, honor before all, that we declare we are the American Fire Service, and America's firefighters leave no one behind.